AHE students. Today we will be reading The Giant Hug. The author of our story, her name is Sandra Horning. What do you want to send to Granny for her birthday? Owen's mother asked. A giant hug, Owen replied, and he opened his arms as wide as he possibly could to show how giant the hug would be. Do you want to draw a picture of you hugging Granny? His mother said. No, Owen said. I want to send a real hug. I'll give the mailman a hug and ask him to send it to Granny. They gathered the letters and walked to the post office in the town. Soon they got in front of the line and Mr. Nevin called out, "Next." I want to mail a hug to my Granny. Will you please send it? Owen asked in his most polite voice. Well, we normally don't send hugs, but I suppose we could give it a try, Mr. Nevin said. Owen's mother wrote down Granny's address for Mr. Nevin. Owen walked behind the counter, opened his arms up as wide as he possibly could, and gave Mr. Nevin a giant hug. Please make this hug just as giant when you pass it on to the mailman, Owen said. Oh, I won't see the mailman who delivers the mail to your Granny. I'll give the mail to Miss Porter, who sorts it and puts it on the truck to the big city. After that, it's put on a plane and flown across the country, Mr. Nevin said. Well, you'll have to give a hug to Miss Porter then, Owen said, and Mr. Nevin carried the mail to Miss Porter. Mr. Nevin looked down awkwardly at Miss Porter as he handed her the mail and the address of Owen's Granny. He blushed a little and mumbled, "Oh, and here's the hug." Mr. Nevin opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Miss Porter a giant hug. Miss Porter smiled and sorted the mail. Just then, the driver came to collect the mail bound for the city. As the driver lifted up the last heavy bag of mail, Mrs. Porter said, "Leroy, there's one more thing. Someone is sending a hug to his Granny. Here's the address and, here's the hug." Mrs. Porter opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Leroy a giant hug. Leroy laughed and said, "Now that's a piece of mail you don't see too often." Lenny whistled all the way back to his city. After unloading the mail, he checked the schedule to see who will be driving the mail to the airport. It read, James. Leroy found James in the break room, eating his morning snack. "Hi, James. I know this seems a little odd, but a hug is being sent through the mail to someone's Granny. Here's her address," Leroy said. Leroy opened his arms as wide as he possibly could, and he gave James a giant hug. But James cringed, because of course he's a porcupine. He was not the hugging type, but he would do this job anyway. All right, later that afternoon, James arrived at the airport. He asked a mail handler when the mail was being loaded into the plane. "The mail was taken to the plane a few minutes ago," the mail carrier said. James rushed to the plane where the Captain Johnson was getting ready to board. "Captain, this kid is sending a hug through the mail to his Granny. Here's the address, and here's the hug." James looked at him with a grimace. James opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Captain Johnson a giant hug. Now, isn't that a grand way to start the day? Captain Johnson yelled, "Ouch!" When the plane landed, Captain Johnson walked to the airport post office. He saw Amanda standing next to the mail truck. She was actually looking kind of sad. "Hello, are you driving the truck to the city?" Captain Johnson asked. "Yes," Amanda said glumly. "A hug is being sent through the mail," Captain Johnson announced. Captain Johnson opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Amanda a giant hug. Ooh, Amanda brightened up and said thank you. She bobbled her head to the music as he drove. After unloading the mail, Amanda went to find Chad, the driver taking the mail to Granny's town. This keeps going on and on. "Chad, a hug is being sent through the mail. Here's the address, and here's the hug," Amanda said as her face turned bright red. Amanda opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Chad a giant hug. Chad chuckled and said, "Well, finally, do you want to go dancing tonight?" "Ooh, I'd love to," said Amanda. Chad kicked up his heels and hopped in the truck. Early the next morning, finally, Chad drove to Granny's town. He was prepared to return to the city. He remembered the hug. Who will be delivering the mail to Pennyside Lane today? Chad asked his supervisor. Shelly, but she's not here yet, Miss Greenberg replied, and she adjusted her glasses. "Please pass this along to her," Chad said. Chad opened his arms as wide as he possibly could and gave Miss Greenberg a hug. Miss Greenberg gasped in surprise, and her glasses tilted to the side. "Shelly, I need a word with you," Mrs. Greenberg called out when Shelly arrived. "A hug is being sent through the mail to a boy's granny, and you are the mailwoman delivering it," Miss Greenberg said. Miss Greenberg opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Shelly a giant hug. "Granny will be delighted," Shelly explained. Shelly stopped to smell the flowers as she delivered the mail from door to door. She saw Granny gardening in the yard. "Mrs. Lewis, I have a special delivery for you," Shelly said. "Your grandson has sent you a hug." Shelly opened her arms as wide as she possibly could and gave Granny a great big hug. Granny grinned and said, "That's the most wonderful piece of mail I've ever received. You send that grandson a big kiss for me." Granny puckered her lips up and gave Shelly a great big wet kiss on the cheek. And you guys can finish the story. And that was our story, The Giant Hug. I see that it made a full circle.